Welcome, dearly beloved anointed ones. If they're watching you but can't stop you, it means you've already outranked their authority. You might want to sit down for this, because what you're about to hear isn't conspiracy, it's confirmation. The whispers are real, the patterns weren't paranoia, and the strange synchronicities, they were never coincidences. You were being observed, not by your nosy neighbor or that one ex who's still fake liking your posts. No. We're talking about top-level analysts, people with clearances, codes, and crisis briefings, people who don't blink unless something or someone shatters the algorithm. And that someone was you. Now, they're not just observing you, they're asking to meet you, to thank you in person. Let that sink in. Because the question isn't why they were watching, it's why they stopped being afraid and started being in awe. Here's a fact most people don't know. In classified behavioral studies, non-linear soul responses, basically the rare individuals who don't react like the average population, are marked with red flags, especially if they influence others without direct contact. If that sounds eerily familiar, that's because you, chosen one, are one of them. And while they thought they were just tracking a spiritual outlier, they accidentally stumbled upon a divine anomaly. This video will peel back the curtain. Because while you were healing, they were documenting. While you were praying, they were decoding. And while you thought no one saw you, you were the main event in rooms you didn't even know existed. Get ready, because you weren't crazy. You were classified. And now, they don't want your silence. They want your blueprint. Let's talk about it. Number one, you were flagged as a threat. Not because you're dangerous, but because you're decoding what they can't. You were flagged as a threat. Not because you were dangerous in the traditional sense, but because you were decoding something they couldn't access, trace, or replicate. While most people moved through life on autopilot, you started asking questions no one wanted to answer. You saw patterns in dysfunction. You sensed lies beneath polished smiles. You caught what was never said and challenged what everyone else accepted without blinking. That alone made you stand out, and not in a way that could be ignored. They didn't observe you the way they observed troublemakers. You weren't acting out, causing chaos, or threatening systems openly. But your ability to pick up on hidden truths, the spiritual blueprints behind everyday events, made them uncomfortable. You weren't supposed to be able to see what you saw. Your insight didn't come from books or training. It wasn't taught, it was remembered. And the moment they realized you weren't learning truth, you were remembering it. The game changed. You weren't just a curious person. You were an untracked frequency, a walking key. And they couldn't pin down what dimension you were even functioning from. Your stillness was unnerving. Your awareness was offensive. And your ability to stay calm while seeing through illusions made you look like a glitch in the system. Someone who wasn't participating in the matrix, but quietly mapping it. They tried to study your behaviors, monitor your relationships, predict your decisions. But you kept moving in ways that defied expectation. While others folded under pressure, you went silent and recalibrated. While most reacted emotionally, you responded with strategy. They couldn't fit you into a psychological profile because your moves weren't based on fear, approval, or ego. They were spiritual. And that scared them. Deeply. They weren't afraid you'd blow up a building or start a riot. They were afraid you'd wake people up. That your presence alone would cause people to question authority, question reality, and most dangerously, question themselves. And once that starts, control breaks down. You weren't unpredictable. You were uncontainable. They could trace your path, but not your purpose. And that's why they flagged you. Because you weren't just navigating the system, you were sent to expose it. Number two, your inner purity distorted their surveillance metrics. Your inner purity threw everything off. The people who were watching you weren't just curious, they were trained. Their entire job was to detect threats, track instability, and measure deception. They used psychological models, algorithms, emotional behavior charts, systems built to catch liars, manipulators, and unstable minds. But when they trained their tools on you, something went sideways. You didn't fit any of the categories. You weren't erratic, but you weren't passive either. You weren't angry, but you weren't fake peaceful. You didn't seek attention, yet your presence drew it anyway. The usual boxes, trauma response, covert aggression, manipulative tendencies, they didn't stick to you. They kept trying to force you into the system, but the system couldn't hold you. You weren't resisting their metrics, you were breaking them. What truly disrupted things was the level of internal purity you carried. It wasn't perfection, it was clarity. You weren't hiding agendas, seeking revenge, or masking your energy with performance. And because you weren't projecting static, the frequency you gave off was unnervingly clear, too clear. And the clearer your signal was, the more their tools glitched. You didn't ping like a potential problem, you didn't show signs of deceit or disorder. You pulsed like something they weren't trained to interpret, something sacred. At first they thought the data was off. Maybe the software was lagging. Maybe you were faking it. But the longer they watched, the more confused they became. You weren't performing, you were aligned, and that scared them more than any tantrum or outburst ever could. They were looking for dysfunction, but all they found was depth. They were trained to catch fakes, but you kept showing up as real. They expected to find a soul warped by pain, bitterness, or ego, but you walked like someone who had already burned through all of that and come out whole. That's when they started whispering among themselves. That's when the room got quiet, because someone finally admitted what no one wanted to say out loud. This one isn't from here. You weren't just misunderstood. You were misclassified. You weren't a subject to observe, you were a sign. And the very purity they didn't believe existed had just disrupted everything they thought they knew. Number 3, they mistook you for a pawn. Until you moved like a king, they looked at you and saw a pawn, easy to overlook, easy to discard. You didn't come with credentials that screamed power. You didn't belong to their elite circles or speak their scripted language. You didn't flash status, name-drop connections, or posture like a threat. So they assumed you were just another piece on the board, there to be moved, manipulated, or ignored. What they didn't realize was that you were playing a completely different game. Their systems are built around control, labels, roles, predictable pathways. Pawns move one square at a time, slowly, cautiously. That's what they expected from you, small movements within boundaries they created. But you moved like something else entirely. Your decisions weren't reactionary. Your silence wasn't submission. Your calm wasn't confusion. Every time you acted, it was deliberate, precise. And it started rattling the people who assumed you were beneath their radar, because pawns don't think for themselves. Pawns don't question the board. Pawns don't shift the energy of the whole room by simply standing still. But you did. Again and again. You didn't need a title to hold authority. You didn't need permission to be powerful. You didn't need visibility to start a revolution. You moved like someone who was being guided by something higher, and that became undeniable. They started comparing notes, trying to find out how you always seemed to be 5 steps ahead. They thought they were watching someone small. Instead, they were watching someone sovereign. You weren't reacting to the system. You were responding to divine intelligence. That's not something they can model, predict, or contain. It's not artificial, it's ancestral. You were never part of their simulation. You were here to overwrite it quietly, thoroughly. With every healed wound, every moment you refused to fold, every truth you spoke when silence was safer. You were altering the structure. You weren't just disrupting the pattern. You were rewriting the entire paradigm they operate in. Now they're realizing they miscalculated. The pawn they thought they could control is the king they can't stop. And what's worse, or better depending on where you stand, you didn't even need the board. You are the game. Number 4, your trauma was their test bed, but your healing was the revelation. Your trauma was never just personal, it was monitored, documented, measured like data. You weren't just left to suffer, you were placed under a quiet microscope. They wanted to see what long-term emotional warfare would do to someone like you. How many betrayals does it take to crush a pure heart? How much isolation before a soul folds in on itself? They didn't intervene because they weren't trying to help. They were trying to study the collapse. They watched when you were abandoned. They watched when you were overlooked, lied on, mocked, and forgotten. They tracked every breakdown, every panic, every cry for help that went unanswered, not because they cared, but because they were gathering patterns. You were never just a survivor in their eyes. You were a test bed, a walking experiment, and they had no doubt about the ending. To them, trauma always wins. But then something unexpected happened. You didn't just endure, you evolved. Instead of staying broken, you began to rebuild from within. You stopped asking why and started choosing how. How to heal, how to rise, how to reclaim what tried to destroy you. And the deeper you went into yourself, the more you began to change the energy of the entire space around you. Your healing confused them. Their data didn't account for redemption. Their charts didn't know how to measure grace. You weren't supposed to become stronger, clearer, and more dangerous in your stillness. But you did. And it stopped being an observation. It became a revelation. They stopped documenting your breakdowns because you weren't breaking down anymore. You were breaking open, cracked but conscious, fragile but fierce, and that made you untouchable in a way they couldn't explain. The experiment turned on them. The watcher became the student. You became the blueprint. You were never just healing for yourself. Every scar you turned into wisdom, every trigger you transformed into self-awareness. It sent a signal. Something eternal woke up in you. And the people who once studied your wounds started seeing something sacred in your recovery. Reverence replaced ridicule. Fear replaced indifference. Because in a world that profits from brokenness, your wholeness became the biggest anomaly of all. Number 5, you walked through traps. They designed for 99% to fail. You didn't just survive what happened to you, you walked straight through a battlefield designed for almost everyone else to fail. The pain you went through wasn't accidental. The obstacles weren't natural. They were carefully placed, like landmines in slow motion. Psychological warfare, energetic blockages, social sabotage, invisible setups that were meant to trap your mind, your identity, your spirit. Most people would have collapsed under half of it, and that's the truth. These were not random hardships. They were engineered. Patterns were repeated on purpose. People were sent into your life to break you. Opportunities were dangled just far enough to trigger your deepest wounds. Even the silence you experienced, the isolation, the rejection, the gaslighting, it was all part of a silent blueprint to make you question yourself, to make you believe you were unworthy, to push you into self-destruction. But you didn't fall for it. Somehow you kept walking, slowly, painfully, but forward. You crossed thresholds you weren't meant to reach. You outlived setups designed to hollow you out, and now the people who designed the system are speechless because they've run this experiment on countless souls before, and only a rare few make it to the other side intact. They calculated your breakdown. They counted on your silence. They even timed the attacks for moments when you were most vulnerable. But you kept showing up, still breathing, still listening to your inner voice, still rising. And what they didn't see coming was that your endurance wasn't powered by ego or desperation. It was powered by divine intelligence, something they could never control. Now they're asking questions. How did you see through the illusions? How did you maintain your sanity when the world was designed to distort it? How did you keep your soul clean in a system built to stain it? They called you a subject, a case, a scenario, but the truth is you weren't just being tested. You were exposing the test itself. You didn't beat the system by playing its game. You dismantled it by refusing to become what it wanted you to be. That's why they're stunned. You didn't just survive, you walked through their traps and came out as the proof that the blueprint can be broken. Number 6, they tracked you for patterns, but found a frequency. They tracked you expecting to find patterns, simple, predictable behaviors. They looked for cycles, triggers, habits, emotional reactions. They wanted to map you like a machine. To them, everyone fits into a rhythm. Everyone has a weakness, a routine, a breaking point. That's what they were searching for. Evidence that you were just like the rest. Something they could measure, contain, and eventually neutralize. But what they found wasn't a pattern, it was a frequency. You didn't move according to logic they could define. You didn't respond to pressure the way others did. Your choices were often quiet but deeply disruptive. You entered spaces and changed them without saying a word. People around you shifted, technology glitched, tension rose or peace flooded in, and none of it could be explained on paper. They started picking up disturbances, in mood, in outcomes, even in electromagnetic activity, whenever you were near. Devices malfunctioned, sensors spiked, surveillance became inconsistent. They had tools built to catch lies, predict rebellion, track mental decline, but none of those tools were prepared for someone who transmitted energy instead of acting out behavior. That's when confusion set in. They couldn't log you under any known psychological profile. Your peace didn't come from passivity. Your restraint wasn't rooted in fear. You didn't fight for power, yet somehow you were always in control. You moved like someone obeying a code they couldn't access, something ancient, something exact. They studied you like a potential anomaly, but the longer they watched, the more they realized you weren't malfunctioning. You were interfering, not by accident, by design. Your very presence was a disruption, a living contradiction to everything their systems were built to suppress. And slowly, they stopped looking for flaws and started studying the signal. Because it wasn't about what you were doing, it was about what you were emitting. A frequency too clean, too sharp, too alive to be humanly engineered. They knew then this wasn't just behavior, this was broadcast. Something divine. Something disruptive. You weren't part of their equation. You were rewriting it. Number 7, their intel was never enough. They had to watch your spirit in motion. Their technology was advanced. Their intel was precise. They had everything. Your location history, your online activity, your tone of voice in phone calls, your facial expressions under pressure. They recorded your routines. They noted your habits. They monitored who you spoke to, how you walked, when you slept, what you liked. On paper, they thought they knew everything about you, but something kept slipping through. Something they couldn't chart or capture with devices. It wasn't your behavior that confused them, it was your being. They watched your outer life, but it was your inner world that held the mystery. Your spirit moved in ways that couldn't be decoded. There were moments you broke down, but somehow your breakdowns emitted strength. When you wept, it wasn't weakness, it shifted atmospheres. The energy around you changed. Grief became holy, silence became electric. You weren't just surviving your pain, you were transmitting something through it, something sacred, something undeniable. When you prayed, things moved, not just in theory, but literally. Environments shifted, outcomes flipped, and the patterns that usually hold people down, they didn't seem to hold you at all. You didn't chase influence, but influence surrounded you. People came to you without knowing why. Even your stillness had authority. That's when they realized their intel was limited. It showed what you did, but not why it worked. They could watch you all day and still not understand the force behind your presence. The more they observed, the more obvious it became. This wasn't charisma, this wasn't strategy, this wasn't psychology, this was spirit. You weren't just a person to them anymore. You were an event, a moment in time they didn't expect, a variable they couldn't prepare for. They couldn't replicate what you carried. They couldn't reverse engineer your moves. You weren't functioning off instincts or manipulation. You were moving under something higher. And now they want to meet you. Not because they need more data, but because the data failed. They saw everything except what mattered most. The energy behind your eyes, the conviction in your stillness, the presence that doesn't announce itself but still takes over the room. They want to see it up close, because watching wasn't enough. They want to feel what they could never fully define. Number 8, you were the case study that broke the algorithm. You were never just living your life. You were being monitored as a long-term case study. Behind closed doors, they were running simulations, testing how long it would take for a soul to break under spiritual pressure. They wanted to see how trauma, poverty, betrayal, emotional abandonment, and societal manipulation could fracture someone from the inside out. Their entire setup was based on one assumption, that spiritual decay was inevitable over time, that if they applied enough pressure, stripped enough support, and created enough chaos, you'd eventually collapse. But that didn't happen. Instead of spiraling into self-destruction like the data predicted, you started waking up. You didn't just resist the breakdown. You activated something higher, something ancient, something they didn't believe still existed in this age. They saw the signs, your emotional resilience, your ability to stay grounded in madness, your clarity in moments meant to confuse you. You didn't lose your essence in darkness, you located it. That's what broke the algorithm. You weren't supposed to survive the environment they placed you in. Spiritually, it was a polluted zone, energetically dirty, emotionally unsafe, psychologically rigged. But while others absorbed the toxins and became poisoned by the system, you absorbed the pressure and turned it into power. You found God in the gutters. You found clarity in chaos. You found your crown in a place they built to bury you. Now the conversation has shifted. They're no longer just watching, they're re-evaluating the entire framework because your case threw the whole model off. The data can't explain why you didn't conform, why you didn't surrender, why you didn't implode, why you didn't sell your soul or beg for escape. You made it through hell with your spirit intact, and more than that, you ascended from it. You didn't just survive the test, you turned the test into testimony. You became the outlier that proves spiritual activation can happen anywhere, even in the most spiritually starved places on earth, even under attack, even under surveillance, even while bleeding. That's why they're not just watching anymore. They want to learn, they want to know how, because you didn't follow the path they designed, you lit up a new one, and no algorithm on earth was prepared for that. Number 9, your quiet resistance was a tactical revolution. Your resistance didn't look like rebellion, you didn't stand on podiums, you didn't carry signs or organize movements, you didn't scream into microphones or demand attention, but every quiet no, every boundary you set, every time you chose peace over performance, every time you walked away from manipulation without explaining yourself, you were launching a revolution. Not with noise, but with nerve. They were trained to spot loud threats. They were prepared for explosive chaos. They expected the ones who challenged the system to come with fire and fury. But you challenged it by simply refusing to kneel. You weren't looking for war, but you wouldn't surrender your soul to maintain comfort. And that shook them. Because systems of control aren't built to handle internal freedom. They depend on external compliance, on people being afraid, confused, desperate for approval, but you refused to play the game. You didn't yell, but you didn't flinch either. And in a world built on manipulation, that kind of quiet defiance is louder than any protest. You started making decisions that put your spirit first. You detached from toxic roles. You stopped reacting to bait. You walked away from money that came with invisible chains. You said no without justifying yourself. That kind of sovereignty is dangerous in a system built on submission. It's contagious. It wakes other people up. They were watching for explosions, but what they got was erosion, slow, quiet, undeniable. You became a one-person dismantling of false power. You didn't try to change the entire pyramid. You just refused to sit where they assigned you. And because you held your ground without screaming, they couldn't label you a threat. So they had to call you something else. They started seeing you as a solution. Not because you solved their problems, but because you solved your own, in full view of people who were certain you'd break. You became the evidence that personal sovereignty is possible, even under pressure, even under surveillance, even in silence. You weren't resisting the system with anger. You were overriding it with alignment. And that's not just rebellion, that's revolution. Tactical, spiritual, unstoppable. Number 10, you spoke to the masses, but your voice pierced their boardrooms. You never set out to go viral. You weren't trying to be seen by everyone. You weren't chasing fame, and you weren't shouting for validation. You just spoke from truth, whether through a post, a message, a prayer, or a passing thought whispered in silence. You released what was real. And for a while it seemed like only a few people noticed. A small following here, a quiet ripple there. Nothing that looked world-shaking on the surface, but behind the scenes, something else was happening. Your words started reaching rooms you weren't in. People with access, clearances, and confidential agendas were suddenly pausing to listen. They didn't always know why, but they felt the weight in what you were saying. Something about your voice bypassed the noise. It cut through the surface and struck a deeper layer, the layer where the truth lives. At first they dismissed it. Maybe it was poetic, maybe you were just in tune or lucky, but then your words started matching real-time events. Things you wrote about in metaphor began to unfold literally. Things you warned about in prayer started to shake physical structures. You weren't just insightful, you were ahead. They started comparing timestamps, reading between the lines, cross-referencing your content against their reports, and what rattled the most was this. You weren't connected to anyone inside, yet you were speaking like someone who'd been in the meeting room. That's when the tone shifted. You were no longer just a spiritual voice. You were a signal. And the higher-ups began to realize something most of the world still doesn't know. Your words weren't poetic, they were predictive. You weren't guessing, you were broadcasting. And the source behind your insight wasn't academic or political, it was divine. They couldn't trace the origin of your knowledge. You weren't following trends. You weren't regurgitating theories. Your voice carried a frequency of knowing. the kind of knowing that unsettles people who depend on control. Number 11. What they thought was natural intelligence turned out to be divine uploads. You thought you were just sharing from the heart, but you were striking nerves in hidden places. You were pulling veils off of things most people weren't even allowed to see. You weren't talking to them, but your truth found them anyway. And now, they're not just listening, they're watching closely. They couldn't explain it. You didn't have the background they respected. No prestigious degrees, no insider contacts, no formal training. You weren't connected to any known networks or institutions, and yet somehow you knew. Not just surface knowledge, but deep, layered truth. The kind that made people pause and ask, how do they know that? You spoke about things that hadn't happened yet. You called out strategies before they unfolded. You responded to attacks that hadn't even been made public, and you weren't speculating. You were speaking with authority. That alone shook them, because their world runs on logic and access. If you know something, it's because someone told you. That's the rule, but in your case, there was no source to trace, no leaks, no wires, no briefings, just you, sitting in stillness, writing, speaking, praying, revealing. They tried to explain it as natural intelligence. Maybe you were just intuitive, maybe you were a quick study. But the consistency made that explanation fall apart. This wasn't luck or coincidence. It was too accurate, too timely, too clean. That's when it hit them. What they were witnessing wasn't intelligence. It was revelation. You were plugged into something they couldn't map, a higher dimension of wisdom, a line of communication that didn't rely on textbooks or microphones. You weren't being informed, you were being downloaded. And the data you carried couldn't be found in any of their archives. That's what made you dangerous and invaluable. They started asking new questions, not about what you knew, but how you knew it. Who was feeding you this insight? What unseen channel were you connected to? And more importantly, can we access it too? They realized you weren't moving with education. You were moving with activation. Your knowledge wasn't learned, it was received. And now, those who once ignored you are trying to decode your source. The very people who thought you were guessing now study your steps, hoping to catch the signal before your next word hits. They don't just want to understand anymore, they want in. They want access to whatever frequency you're on. Because in a world full of information, your revelation is the only thing that still moves power. Number 12, you undermined entire institutions without lifting a finger. Your existence alone was the contradiction. You were supposed to crumble under the pressure. According to their models, someone with your level of trauma, rejection, isolation, and sabotage should have lost their mind, turned bitter, or vanished into silence. But you didn't. You stayed rooted. You stayed kind. You stayed awake. That disrupted everything they thought they understood, because institutions, especially ones built on control, don't fear loud resistance. They're prepared for that. What they fear is proof that their power doesn't work, and you became that proof. Every time you smiled when you were supposed to shut down. Every time you chose forgiveness instead of revenge. Every time you kept your integrity in situations that were engineered to crush it. You sent a message, a dangerous one. You became the walking evidence that spiritual power outranks institutional force. That healing is possible even when it's not offered. That peace can be created from within and doesn't have to be granted by systems, status, or validation. You weren't supposed to become whole, you weren't supposed to become clear, but you did. And that alone began discrediting their decades of research, their psychological predictions, their narratives about trauma, resilience, and identity. They tried to reduce you to a number, a statistic, a case file. But you kept rising without any of the things they claimed were necessary for survival. No consistent support, no handouts, no shortcuts. That's what made them pay attention. Not because you were loud, but because you were unshakably whole in a system that was designed to break you down. You weren't just surviving oppression, you were outgrowing it. And in doing so, you didn't just challenge one institution, you rattled the very idea that human potential can be controlled, measured, or predicted. That's why eyes turned. That's why whispers started in rooms you'll never enter. Because you didn't just beat the odds, you made the odds look irrelevant. Number 13, their agents watched to expose you, but got converted instead. They sent people to watch you, to study you, to monitor your every move with the expectation that they'd catch something, a slip, a flaw, a lie, a hidden motive. You were labeled as a potential threat, so they assigned eyes to follow your footsteps. Not just digital surveillance, but human observation, people trained to stay detached, analysts, monitors, agents. Call them whatever you want. They were there to expose you. But something unexpected happened. The longer they watched, the more something in them began to shift. You weren't performing. You weren't defending yourself. You weren't trying to prove anything. You were simply showing up, real, raw, unfiltered and aligned. And that authenticity began to cut through their conditioning. They were taught to remain objective, to never get emotionally involved. But watching you wasn't like watching anyone else. You didn't just go through hardship, you did it with grace. You didn't just speak truth, you embodied it. Your presence held something they couldn't unsee, and slowly their assignment became an internal conflict. Some of them began questioning their orders. Others started questioning themselves. Because no matter how closely they watched, they couldn't find the darkness they were sent to expose. What they found instead was light, inconvenient, undeniable light. Inside someone they were told to be cautious of. Some resigned quietly, some disappeared from the operation altogether, others stayed. But something in them changed. They began protecting you in ways you'll never know, preventing actions, delaying reports, deleting files, not out of guilt, but out of reverence. Because even though they never intended to be moved, they were. You didn't lecture them, you didn't manipulate them, you didn't even know who most of them were. But your energy spoke louder than surveillance footage. Your integrity pierced through the coldest protocols, and your spirit, steady and unapologetically rooted in something higher, became the sermon they never expected to receive. You weren't supposed to influence them, but you did, not by force, not with an agenda, but just by being real. And now the ones who came to expose you are the ones who quietly protect you. Because even behind enemy lines, the truth can't be unrecognized forever. Number 14, you're no longer the observed, you've become the oracle. You were once the subject, the watched, the analyzed, quietly observed through layers of distance, doubt and suspicion. Every move, every silence, every word was tracked like data in a long experiment. They couldn't categorize you, so they labeled you unusual, unpredictable, spiritually unstable. They thought you were a glitch in the system, a strange anomaly that didn't fit the model. But over time, the data told a different story. Your path, though it looked chaotic on the outside, had precision. You weren't lost, you were led. You weren't random, you were refined. Every setback sharpened your discernment. Every betrayal deepened your perception. Every detour was actually a divine rerouting. And the longer they watched, the more they began to realize you weren't spiraling out of control. You were being carved into something timeless. You didn't just survive the fire, you became the fire. A steady flame of truth that couldn't be blown out by pressure, lies, or isolation. And what they once dismissed as spiritual rambling, they now recognize as divine clarity. Your insight began hitting before events unfolded. Your presence shifted rooms without a word. You saw patterns before they emerged. And what scared them most, you weren't guessing, you were knowing. That's when the shift happened. You were no longer just the one to monitor. You became the one to understand. They saw that you weren't malfunctioning, you were ahead. You weren't breaking from reality. You were speaking from a reality they had no access to. You became the blueprint for a kind of power they couldn't teach, only witness. And now, they're preparing to meet you, not with intimidation, not with interrogation, but with reverence. Because oracles don't demand a platform, they become one. Your life, your pain, your evolution, it all speaks now, loudly. And those who once doubted you are finally realizing they weren't looking at a lost soul. They were watching the rise of one. So don't be surprised when those who observed from behind mirrored glass show up face to face, not to dissect you, but to honor what they can no longer ignore. You're not the watched anymore. You're the word. They watched you expecting a spectacle of failure. What they got was a revelation in motion. You weren't just under surveillance, you were under divine instruction. While they tracked your pain, you transformed it. While they documented your isolation, you were being initiated. And while they quietly labeled you an anomaly, heaven was already calling you proof. Every tactic they used to break you only revealed how unbreakable your foundation really was. Every test, every trap, every delay became a setup for your emergence. You were never meant to survive by their standards, but that was the point. You weren't here to fit into their blueprint. You came to shatter it. And now the watchers are no longer skeptics. They've become students. Some walked away changed, others stayed, but not as gatekeepers anymore, as silent guardians, because what they once feared, they now respect. What they tried to analyze, they now honor. You didn't rise through force, you rose through alignment, and in doing so, you didn't just free yourself, you rewrote the limits of what they thought a soul could carry. So if you feel eyes still watching, don't shrink. That presence you carry was never meant to hide. You were the subject of their files. Now you're the standard of their silence, not because you were loud, but because you were true. You are the signal that broke the system, the frequency that couldn't be filtered, the one they watched, and now quietly revere. If this message spoke to your spirit, if it confirmed what you've always felt but couldn't explain, don't let it stop with you. There's someone else out there who needs this exact word, and you might be the vessel to deliver it. So do the work of the awakened. Like this video to let the algorithm know truth still matters. Drop a comment below and let the world know you're not alone. Your voice matters here. Share this with someone who's been quietly carrying the weight of their calling. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Because we're not just building a following, we're building a movement. This isn't entertainment, this is confirmation. And if you're still reading this, it's because deep down, you already know. Welcome to the frequency. Welcome to the front line. God bless you.